Today we're going to be doing something a little bit different from all of the ink instruction that I've been up to as of late. I'm going to be working through / talking through an actual execution of a drawing. I think this is important. You can spend so much time learning about, or from my perspective, focusing on the education of particular techniques, and end up losing sight of the fact that all of these are to be implemented. They are not techniques to be used in isolation. They are supposed to be applied to something. And so today's drawing is actually my first piece for March of the Robots 2025. I've never actually done this before, though I've been interested in it. I'm doing it rather informally. I love drawing robots, and so this is simply an excuse to dive into that. So that being said, let's go ahead and take a look at how I'm actually starting this piece. You might notice that I have an Undersketch. This is something that I wish I would have recorded the process for, but to be honest, it's pretty loose. Generally, when I sketch out my robots, I give myself basic shapes. I want to make sure that the silhouette is interesting. And so as you're sitting down to draw your own robot, or anything really, think about the silhouette that things make. Because ink is such a permanent substance, once it goes down, it's there unless you use something like whiteout or acrylic to go over it and fix it. It's just in existence. Because of this, I try to make sure that at least my big shapes are planned. And mostly this is for silhouette, and secondarily, it's to understand which things are in front of others. Because I wanted to have this single finger of this hand, for example, up against the jaw, I needed to make sure that I drew that first. And this is why sketching things out at the beginning can be so helpful. I have done a lot of these without any sketch, and it's totally fine. If that's how you like to work, if you feel like your creativity is hampered by sketching, I would encourage you to try it periodically anyway. Just as a teacher, it's good for you to get out of your comfort zone and try new things, but I do many of these that way. There's nothing wrong with that. I find that my drawings are a little bit more expressive and a little bit more accurate. I can have a lot of overlapping parts and understand them better when I do put down an underlying sketch. But I also find that after I do 5 or 6 of these highly detailed pieces, I will usually do 1 or 2 that are really quick without an undersketch. So just be aware there is no right way to do it, but whatever your normal disposition is, I would encourage you to try the opposite. In this case, the sketch was working on the idea of big, so I wanted to have a big, hefty, hardy robot. And he's just going to be kind of wandering around. I didn't have anything crazy sophisticated. I know for myself, starting a new challenge of sorts, I have a tendency to get in over my head. So I wanted to make sure that the first iterations were at least fairly simple so that I wouldn't cause myself too much of a headache or a heartache if things didn't go according to plan. This is, again, part of the reason why I sketched for this one. So if you are starting something that happens to be a little bit stressful, I would encourage you to give yourself a sketch, give yourself something to fall back on. As I begin an ink piece like this, you'll notice I don't start with much of my hatching. I don't start adding texture or anything like that until I know where my big shapes are. This is because if I start adding it now thinking that I understand what I'm doing, I might trap myself into something. If I create a shadow and then later on decide that I don't want to have the thing above it that I hadn't put in yet, that shadow no longer makes sense. So I like to make sure I have a substantial amount of the context around an element before I start adding texture or any shading. I'm going to go around with this brush pen at the beginning and simply make sure that everything that I'm putting in, kind of makes sense. I use this brush pen rather than my standard microns at the beginning for a couple of reasons. First of all, I find that the fact that the lines that it makes are not perfect actually adds a lot of character to the piece. It feels less perfect. And what this does for me is it adds a lot more just random nuance that the medium itself will add without me having to think about it. I find that I have an issue when I work with a single thickness of pen or when I do digital artwork, and that issue is that everything feels a little bit too pristine and manufactured. I can get rid of some of this by making sure that the mediums that I'm using are actually being applied in a way where the medium has some say. I like to remove a little bit of my control. Don't get me wrong, I like having a high degree of control with much of what I do artistically, but I like ink particularly because it's got its own set of rules, and I like to let it be. I run into the same thing when I'm painting. I like to make sure that my paints are allowed to be what they are, that I, as a human, am not trying to bring everything under my own thrall and domain. I like to let my medium be my medium. And in this case, ink does wonderful things when you let it flow, when you let it do what it's doing. I'll often go in later on and add in some dots and texture to actually approximate the splatter and some of the drips that you would get from working with traditional ink. Maybe one of these days I'll get brave enough to actually go back into traditional ink. I do have a couple vials of ink here that I would love to try out. But at this beginning stage, most of what I'm doing is just going around marking out the big shapes, working out which elements are where, what overlaps another element, and it's a pretty slow process. This is not necessarily the most fun part of it. In fact, I think this is probably the most stressful process. So if you find yourself in a similar position where this gives you a little bit of anxiety or stress, just know that that makes sense. You're putting down all of the pieces that are later on just going to be things that you work on adding texture and shading to. This is the difficult stage. Each element you're adding now is the most malleable it will ever be. You can fix some things later, but it's often better if you don't have to, if you think about what you're doing. So this is the portion of the process that I would urge you to slow down. As you're going over your sketch, or if you didn't sketch, you're just working on the early stages, I would encourage you to go slowly. And if you are making a robot, which I hope you are, I would encourage you to just think about really simple shapes. At the beginning here, I don't try to make it look human. I don't try to make it look like something from a video game where it's perfect. I think kind of the goofy robots are a little bit more fun. So just start with big blocky shapes. I did find that over the course of doing the 120 or so robots I've done in the last year, that if you add a little bit of emotion to them, if you give them mouths, I like to give big, chunky teeth. If you give eyes, if you actually put an iris or a pupil in the eye, those kinds of things make it a little bit more identifiable. So I would urge you to do that. What I'm doing now is I'm actually going in with my Micron and filling in some of the small gaps in the brush pen. I don't worry about making the brush pen layer perfect. And this always means then that I do have to go by later and I have to fill in gaps. This is a much more consistent pen. This is the one I use for all my instructional videos. It's just a 01 in Micron Pigma. I believe that's a 0.25 millimeter. If I'm incorrect, I'll put that on the screen during editing. But this is just to square up some things. This is also a slightly less stressful medium for me. So as I'm working with it, I am alleviating some of the innate kind of shoulder crunching stress that comes with putting down those initial layers. I will start adding some texture here, mostly because I can't stop myself. This is the part of ink drawing I really, really enjoy. But also during this stage, it's not bad to start thinking about where things overlap other things in the sense of what's going to cast a shadow onto something else. Now, if you are like me, and drawing mechanical things doesn't come very naturally to you, I would encourage you at the beginning to just start putting plates and bolts on things. Think of these large shapes as being made of metal. You'll notice that I will often just put plates or raised portions, playing a lot with perspective, and when I have large areas like the chest here, I'll make sure that it's broken into individual segments. You can see that right below his neck, and then below that a little bit further. This helps with selling the illusion that this is a robot. If you have particular portions where you're not sure what to do, maybe you don't know how to create the joint in between fingers or arms or elbows, you can cover those in fabric. That's a really good idea, kind of like what we did when we were younger and you didn't want to draw hands, so you put them in pockets. Or you can just create a random geometric shape and then fill it in black. I've done this in a lot of my drawings when I didn't want to actually think about the intricate components of what's going on there. The more I've progressed though, the more I've tried to work on adding in mechanical elements that actually look like they would function. If you look at the left arm here, for example, left as we are looking at it, it has these two cylinders, these flat cylinders that basically give the idea that those would allow for rotation. Now the joint where the shoulder is going to connect on that side would obviously need to be a ball joint, otherwise it's not going to function correctly. But you'll notice that I'll obscure that so I don't have to draw it. On some of my drawings, I will put in those kind of intricate details. But if you're anything like me, and those elements might be a little bit intimidating, you don't have to do them all the first time. I would encourage you to simplify when you're making your first robots. And the reason that I think robots are such a good thing to do is they have any anatomy that you want them to have. You can make a robotic dragon, a robotic centaur, a robotic human, a robotic strawberry. It doesn't matter. So you've got some variance there. But you also get to play with more cartoony elements. So there's a little bit of additional grace in that direction. The other side is inevitably it allows you to work with three-dimensionality and perspective. So many of these elements on here are just prisms or cylinders, spheres, cubes, and boxes. All of these elements you're going to need to draw regardless of what your main topic is. And so robots are going to give you the opportunity to practice lots of those things. The big thing for me, because perspective came easier at the beginning, I'm not perfect at it obviously, but it was an easier thing for me, is the surface texture. My robots nowadays, if you go back and look at the original, or you look at the video, which I can link below, which was my 100 robot challenge I did last year for myself, the robots at the beginning had basically no surface texture. Any of the large planes are just a giant large plane. And on these current ones and the more recent ones, there's a lot of texture on each of those pieces of metal, giving the idea that this metal has sat around for a while. It's not brand new from the factory where it's, glowing and glistening and waxed, because that's less interesting. I talked about this before on the channel, and I'm certainly not the first person or last person to talk about it, but part of the reason that these Star Wars movies feel so convincing in their world building is that everything looks like it's old. If you look at most of the sci-fi movies that came before the first Star Wars movie, everything looks perfect and pristine. But when you look at Tatooine on episode 4, everything's kind of scuffed up. Well, of course it is. It's a desert planet. How long could you have a land speeder before it would have some wear and tear from the sand? Maybe a week or two? So doing that on the robots actually makes them more authentically believable. And that's a really good thing. You'll notice as I'm working on the top of these cylinders on that left shoulder is I'm working with inset things. This is another really good thing to practice when you're drawing your robots, but also just a good thing to be aware of. Light responds differently when something is inset versus extruding. The shadows will actually often be exactly reversed from one another. And though I haven't talked about it much yet, light is something that you really need to consider here. I have probably arbitrarily decided that the light is coming from the upper right, but very gently from the upper right. I will often not think about where my light source is coming from unless I'm doing educational material or I'm setting up a really large, pretty sophisticated composition. This might be a weakness of mine, something that I need to look into, but if you find that it doesn't come naturally to you, that's just fine. But it is good to be aware of where your light source comes from, especially when you start adding the texture and the shading, because this is going to direct you. This is going to tell you where you need to make those marks. And it's going to tell you whether the left side, the right side, or only below things directly is going to be shaded in. So I'm going to progress here a little bit, add on some more of these shapes, but I am going to skip ahead a little bit so that you can see some of the more sophisticated portions later on, or maybe some areas where I'm adding in some additional texture. All right, I have skipped ahead 13 minutes, so this is currently at 26 minutes of draw time. I decided to do this cutaway rather than speed it up because I think that it's important to watch someone else draw at their own natural speed. I don't draw very quickly. I do sometimes appear as if I draw quickly because I draw rather intentionally once I get going, but the planning stages are not what you're seeing. The thinking that's happening in my head or in between sessions is not something you're going to see. But I skipped to this portion specifically because I run into an impasse. I start doing this chain and I'm not exactly sure what I want to do with it, so lo and behold, I bring back out my pencil. I'm going back to sketching because I'm just not exactly sure what I want to do with this. Even though the thing that I'm going to put in here is really strange and it doesn't really have any purpose, I still didn't have a clear enough idea. So if you feel like you get to a point like this in your drawing, robot or otherwise, and you're not exactly sure what to do, don't feel any shame or embarrassment pulling that pencil back out and doing a little bit of additional sketching. There's nothing wrong with that. I know that there can be some stigma, but generally that stigma is self-created. Let's also take a moment while I'm working on some of these other elements and look at what's been completed in the last few minutes. That claw hand on the left side is there. It's mostly a simple shape, but if you look at the top of it where it hits kind of the gears that are going to help move it, you'll notice that I've obscured a little bit of that edge. It's kind of, not really obscured, but I've broken that edge up, almost as if the metal itself has been dented. This is something I did just because I didn't want the plate to be so simple. So I made sure that I made it, a little bit more intriguing. The leg that I'm working on right now, I decided to have come slightly toward us. And so that means as I'm working out those shapes that I'm having the cylindrical wraparound on that upper thigh move in such a fashion that we can tell that it's going away from us. This is a really simple technique when it comes to cylinders, but something that I often do just to make sure as I'm shading something or understanding it structurally, I know whether it's coming toward me or going away. And this can be really easily applied by wrapping lines around whatever your shape is. These lines are referred to as cross contour lines. They're going across the actual physical shape of the object. And I'm going to start working on the legs here. I often find myself kind of confused when I come to the groin of the robots. I try to generally build them off of animal or human anatomy, and I know that I need a structure there. What I mean by this, though, is in my brain, often I want to just have the legs come off the torso. But if you think about that for more than a moment, it would kind of look awkward and would also mean that the robot would have very limited mobility. So there needs to be a pelvis of sorts that can allow for additional movement. If you think about your robots in the same way you would think about anatomy, you're actually getting in good practice for drawing figures and characters, because your robots generally are going to be based on a head, an abdomen, a pelvis, and then the limbs are going to come off of that. It doesn't matter if the limbs are tentacles. It doesn't matter if the limbs are many. If you build things in that structural foundation, you'll find that you almost always get a chance to practice things. Practice your anatomy and your figure drawing. Yes, I do believe that robots are the answer. If you want to get better at drawing, you should draw robots, because robots will allow you to practice anything you want with a little bit less stress. You want to work on figures but don't want to deal with faces? Well, guess what? Your robots don't have to have faces that are particularly expressive. You want to work on expressions? Well, you can do it on robots too. They are maybe the perfect answer to whatever it is that ails you drawing-wise. I find that I often work with a mix of anatomy and skeletal structure. I'm thinking about what's going on underneath that is making something function in a particular way. So if you look at the sketching here, and I'm sure that I'll actually put this in just a moment as I'm recording this over, I have a ball where the knee is, kind of the knee joint itself. Though you can't see the two components coming together, there would be an element there that would allow for that. This allows me to practice things that are happening inside of a figure, inside of the anatomy of some structure. From my perspective, and especially as a teacher, this is a really wonderful boon, because it gives you the ability to practice things in a more controlled environment, in a situation where you're able to avoid some of the complexities and only focus on a reduced amount of elements at a particular time. This is important. In fact, this is the most important thing when it comes to learning almost any aspect to any new skill, is eliminating enough factors that you can focus on a singular element. If you think about it like sports, right? If you are trying to learn how to play basketball, they don't just throw you onto the court for the entirety of practice and for all of the tryouts and everything and go, okay, cool, just play basketball. No, they break it down like, here's how to dribble. Here's how to dribble well. Here's how to pass. Let's practice passing. Here's a layup. Here's how we practice layups. Here's shooting. Here's free throws. All of these things are broken down into their constituent pieces so that you, as a player, as a new person to that task, can learn that skill. This is how humans work, it seems. So if you want to draw a comic book, you want to draw complex figures in complex poses, you can't do that by just doing that immediately. At least it is not the most efficient way. There is something to be said for practicing the same thing over and over and over again, but it is not the most efficient way. If you're trying to learn an instrument, just simply jumping on the violin and trying to do everything at once might work, but in my experience, it never has. Now, I don't like talking in absolutes because I know that there are people who have just dived into whatever it is they want to work on artistically and it has worked for them. But if you watch them, who are the exception, and then think, I'll do the same thing, you're bound to be discouraged when it doesn't work out in exactly the same way. So if your experience has been different and that's what you've done, kudos to you. Wonderful. I am so glad that that's how that's occurred. But for most normal human beings, we need to break things down and practice them in small pieces and components. And so that's what the robots allow. The robots allow for the reduction in the amount of elements you are processing at any given time. Now, you can see on this foot, I don't really want to work on all the internal components there. So just like I mentioned earlier, I'm kind of darkening things. I'm making sure that it looks like enough is there that you can imply that things function correctly, but mostly I'm just worried about making sure the shapes work. This leg, though I didn't intend it earlier, it really does feel like it's coming toward us. So as I go to do the next one, I don't want to mirror that. In the same way that you want to make sure your characters are contrapposto, they have, some balance between their legs. If one leg's coming forward, I need to make sure that the other leg is going backward. So that's what I'm going to work on with this second leg here. If you find yourself looking at this drawing and wondering how long it's going to take you to get to a point where you're able to make things like this, first of all, understand that I am not an expert on the construction of mechanical objects and robots. I have simply drawn a lot of them. I decided last year, like I mentioned earlier, that I was going to do a series of 100 robots. Originally, I decided I was going to do one a day for the first 100 days of 2024. Of course, that didn't happen because I, like so many of us, get distracted or get discouraged by things, and I didn't follow through. But what I did do is I didn't give up, and I made sure that on the project as a whole, I did follow through, and I did eventually finish it. If I had continued counting, I think I'd be at about 120 or 130 now, and I may go back at some point and actually do some math and figure out where I'm at. But just keep in mind that if you go look at the video that I've got linked below, you'll notice that like my first 2 or 3 dozen robots are not great. And part of that was getting in the rhythm of it. Part of that was you just need to practice something for a while until you start to figure out how you make that thing. And that part, I think, is very important because the way you make your robots, your dragons, your figures, your comics is going to be unique to you. This sounds like a cop-out answer, and it can be, depending on how it's applied. I am not meaning that there is no truth to how you learn things, no truth to how you create a thing. What I'm saying is there is an individualized reality to how you are going to work on a given thing. So yes, there are going to be some consistent traits to how anyone draws a robot. However, you need to learn how those things function for you. My first couple dozen robots were trying to figure that out. I was copying things from other artists, not just straight across, but figuring out how they used, different kinds of techniques to make metal look right, how they were structuring arms and legs and such. If you notice through those first pieces, I was going back and forth frequently, trying to figure out how pristine are these? How run down are they? Can I do broken pieces? Do they have to make some amount of sense? And it took a long time. It took over a month of drawing them for me to really feel like I'd honed in on what I like. Now, if you look at most of my robots, they're fairly consistent. This is because I fell into habits and I discovered some methodologies that I enjoy. They yield the results that I'm looking for. So if you're wondering how long it's going to take for you to get to a point like that, it's not really like how long is it going to take you to learn how to draw a robot well or draw robots like me, which should not be your goal. It will take an amount of time for you to learn how you like to draw robots or dragons or whatever. Robots are just my proxy. I would wager that it's probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 to 20 hours or more. If that sounds like a lot of time, it is. But art takes a lot of time. It's worth taking a lot of time. It took me, I would say, 30 to 50 robot drawings. And some of those took, 15 minutes. Some of them took 5 hours. It really depended. I do think that the quicker drawings probably progress you faster. You learn a lot in the initial stages of a drawing and not quite as much in the polishing stages. So if you are in a learning stage, you're trying to wrap your head around things, you should do projects, pieces that take a long period of time, give you the ability to show off all of what you've learned. But you should concentrate primarily on quick, iterative drawings. In my case, this would be little robots that take less than an hour, and I would try to do one a day for, a month, 2 months. By the end of that, it's really cool because you can look back and go, goodness, look at all these things I've done. But also, you're going to figure out how you like to work. You're going to figure out what your trends are. You're going to figure out how you do things and how you want to do things. You're also going to find the things that you don't do well, which was really important for me. I found that there were certain things that I did not like about how my robots were coming together. And that could only occur because I was putting enough time into them to try to figure out how they functioned. So I would go and research things. But I wouldn't go and just copy someone else's robot drawing. I would go find a drawing of metal or robot or construction material and go, how do they connect arms to the torso? How do they connect legs to the pelvis? How are they handling joints? Are they giving them emotion? And if they are, how are they doing that? Those kinds of things were really helpful to me. So whatever those elements are for you as you kind of embark on this journey or whatever it is that you're studying, go find those elements in other artists. But this is really important. Don't focus just on practice. If you focus just on practice, you know what you'll get really good at? Practice. And I doubt that any of you listening, your desire and your goal artistically is to be really good at practicing art. No, I would wager that pretty much every single one of you wants to execute things. You want to execute pieces. You want to bring things into existence. And yes, you have to practice in order to do that. But practice alone will not save you, and it will not lead you in the right direction. If you go back to learning basketball, if all you ever did was practice basketball and you never actually played against other players, you would be terrible at the game. And of course, the purpose of practicing basketball is to play a game and win a game at basketball. So if you're trying to win at art, which I kind of hate the term, but for the analogy's sake, I suppose, if you're trying to do well at art, you need to practice, and then you need to apply the things that you've practiced. And I've talked a lot here about why I think robots are a great way to do that in the abstract, but also they're just fun. You can see in this drawing alone the progress that has occurred in my own journey and the ability to practice so many elements that are coming out other places. But at the end of the day, there's also just a cool robot sitting there and looking at you on the page. And that's rewarding in its own right. It's a positive thing. Right now, I'm starting to go through and add in a lot more shading. I'm trying to think about how each of these things are going to interact with one another. This makes it look far more realistic. Most of the work on this piece has been done at this point. I find this stage to be really relaxing and kind of rewarding. You can overdo it, and so I would encourage you when you get to this stage of a drawing to take a little bit of a break here and there. Step back, look at the piece, like I'm doing right now. You see me pull my pen back and kind of take a look and go, what needs to be added? What do we need to do here? What needs to come into, its own in a different way? I'm noting as I'm looking at this as the casual observer recording the voiceover that the plate on the left upper arm and on the right forearm and hand are untextured. I'm curious if I will texture them. I imagine I will. But those kinds of things you notice when you take a break for a moment. If you just sit there and keep going on the drawing, you don't really know when you're done, and you can't necessarily have an accurate understanding of what you're looking at. You have to take breaks here and there and look at the piece. This robot is kind of a chunky boy. Do the parts on him make total sense? No, but they make enough sense. You can tell he's walking, he's kind of puzzling about something, although the finger that's on his chin was not rendered particularly well. It's not really distracting either. What about the random shape on the back that's coming off of the one shoulder that I'll add on the other shoulder later? What about this weird element that he's holding that's kind of chained to his elbow? These don't make sense. I don't know what they are, but that's okay. In fact, it's a good thing. It's a beneficial thing, especially on a drawing with mechanical stuff, to have elements that you don't understand in their entirety. Because to be honest, when you look at a car, when you open the engine bay of a car, when you look at an airplane, you as a commoner probably don't understand what each of those components do. And if you are an airplane mechanic and listening to this, hello, by the way, but there are going to be other machines that you don't understand when you look at. And so adding in some aspects that are maybe vestigial components of something else, or maybe you just don't understand them, adds a layer of authenticity. This is something that comes up in my world building sessions a lot too. If you haven't checked those out, I would encourage you to do so. They're structured very similarly to how this video has been structured. In those sessions, I often talk about adding in random things, vestigial parts of an earlier era that just continue to, show up, or elements that the people in the story don't understand. And this adds a level of complexity and realism to things because we as humans don't understand every part of our reality either. Speaking of not understanding all the elements, I'm skipping ahead again. And in this chunk, I'm just going to be adding in some of the final details. I've got about 5 minutes left on this drawing, and this drawing took 54 minutes total. So you're getting to see the lion's share of it. I did add something on this right shoulder, as you're seeing me work on now, and I've added in a lot of additional texture. Particularly though, the part that I want to draw you to is the shadow and the grass underneath this character. These kinds of things are small details. They take very little in the way of time, but they give so much context. If you're drawing a landscape and you don't put an element in there that allows for context of size, I think that's an error most of the time. That can be done as easily as adding a tree, but if you give a figure a chance to be in that drawing, if you add in a building, something that is structural, that gives the idea of what the human scope and scale is, you will allow the viewer to get inside that piece much more easily. In this case, it's as simple as this character is walking through an area. He's not just floating on a blank page anymore. There's something below him. This is such a subtle thing, but it's so important. If you're drawing figures, I would encourage you to add in one environmental element. This looks like dry ground with some grass. That's all I needed to add to make it feel just a little bit more realistic, a little bit more grounded, though the pun is not lost on me. If you're working on drawing dragons, where are they? What are they flying over? If you're drawing a fantasy landscape or even a real landscape, try adding in something small, maybe even a tiny, tiny little figure. It makes the piece look so much more relatable and grandiose. These are elements that are really low on the amount of time that they take to add, but very, very important. Well, thank you for staying with me for this whole video. We are 32 minutes in at this point as I'm recording. So if you're still here with me, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. In these kinds of videos, I don't just talk about exactly what it takes to draw this thing. I try to talk about my thought behind it because I feel like that has a lot more longevity. I would love to hear from you in the comments below, though, about that process. Do you want me to take some more time and focus specifically on why I'm making every decision? That seems to me like that might be a little bit confining and only applicable to that particular drawing. But I would love to hear your thoughts. My goal here is to give the kind of feedback that I think is going to be able to be taken and applied to a myriad of different places. I don't think that all of you need to draw robots alone, though I do think all of you should draw robots. Thanks again for being here, and thank you to my patrons as well, who are on the screen right now. In addition, there is a link in the description to our Discord server, which is specifically for helping one another get better at drawing and having some support and some encouragement in that journey. If you'd like to check it out, especially if you're out of high school or college and you're not in a creative field right now, it might be really beneficial for you to have some other people to talk to about your artistic desires and needs. Have a good one, y'all. See you soon. Go draw some robots.